I sat down at my kitchen table one Tuesday night in October, about 3 years ago now, with my King James Bible, a yellow legal pad, and a number 2 pencil. My wife had been gone almost a year by then, and I wasn't sleeping much. 2, 3 in the morning, the house so quiet you could hear the refrigerator humming 2 rooms away. I'd been reading through the Gospels again, the way I had 100 times before, but something was picking at me, something I couldn't name. So I decided to do what any old history teacher would do. I decided to count. I drew a line down the middle of the legal pad. On the left side I wrote Son of Man. On the right side I wrote Son of God. And I started in Mark chapter 1 verse 1, and I read every single verse, and every time Jesus referred to himself, I made a tick mark in the appropriate column. It took me about 4 hours. I went through Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. When I was done, I set the pencil down and looked at that legal pad. The left column, Son of Man, filled up page after page. I had to flip to a second sheet, then a third. The right column, Son of God, had almost nothing in it. A few marks, and even those I had to put asterisks next to because I wasn't sure Jesus was the one actually saying it. I sat there staring at that pad with my coffee gone cold and my hands shaking a little, and I want to be honest with you, I felt the floor tilt under me. 50 years of Sunday school, 50 years of sermons, 50 years of singing hymns about the Son of God, and here was Jesus, in his own words, calling himself something else entirely. 80-some times he chose one title, and the church built its entire identity around the other one. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of thing that keeps a 67-year-old man up until the birds start singing. Now let me walk you through what I found, because the numbers matter. And I mean the actual numbers, not impressions, not feelings, not what someone told me in a sermon. I'm a history teacher. Was a history teacher. 35 years of telling teenagers to check the primary source. So that's what I did. I checked the primary source. In the Gospel of Mark, which most scholars agree was written first, somewhere around 65 to 70 AD, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man 14 times. 14. I went through every chapter, every verse, pencil in hand, and I circled each one. In Matthew, which came later, he says it 30 times. 30. Luke records it 25 times. And in John, the last gospel written, about 12 or 13 times, depending on how you count a couple of disputed passages. Add those up, and you get somewhere between 81 and 87 uses, depending on which manuscript tradition you follow, and whether you count a few textual variants that show up in older manuscripts, but not in newer ones. The point isn't the exact number. The point is the scale of it. Now here's the thing that stopped me cold. Every single one of those is Jesus speaking. That's his voice. He chose this phrase. He returned to it over and over and over again, in every kind of context you can imagine. Mark chapter 2 verse 10, he says, "The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." Mark 8:31, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders." Mark 14:62, "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." That's Jesus talking about himself in his own words. Now look at the other column. Look at who says Son of God. Mark chapter 5 verse 7, "There's a man possessed by demons who screams, 'What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?'" That's a demon talking. Mark 15:39, the Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." That's a pagan soldier who just watched an execution. In Matthew chapter 16, Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That's a disciple making a confession. The gospel narrators use it. Angels use it. The devil uses it during the temptation. But Jesus himself, he almost never says it. And when he does, it's ambiguous, debated by scholars, often a response to someone else using the term, rather than him choosing it freely. Think about that for a second. The title that defines 2 billion people's faith, the title carved into every church, printed on every tract, sung in every hymn, is a title that almost everyone used for Jesus, except Jesus. The title he actually chose, the one he reached for 87 times, is the one most Christians can barely explain. So what does Son of Man actually mean? This is where things get uncomfortable, because the answer isn't what I was taught, and I suspect it isn't what you were taught either. Jesus spoke Aramaic. His daily language, the language he preached in, argued in, prayed in, was a Galilean dialect of Aramaic. And in Aramaic, the phrase he used was bar enash, sometimes bar nasha. And what it meant in ordinary everyday Aramaic was simply a human being, or even just I. It was a way of referring to yourself without saying I directly, the way someone might say a man gets tired of waiting when they really mean I'm tired of waiting. It was an idiom, a humble, common, everyday turn of phrase. In 1965, a scholar named Geza Vermes, who was himself a former Catholic priest turned historian, published research showing that bar nasha in Galilean Aramaic functioned as what linguists call a circumlocution for the first person. It was a way of saying I, me, a person like myself. Another scholar, Maurice, spent decades finding over 30 examples of this usage in Aramaic texts from around Jesus' time period. When Jesus said the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, according to this research, he was most likely saying something like, I have nowhere to sleep tonight. Not a grand theological claim, not a divine title, just a tired man on the road telling his followers he didn't have a bed. I need you to sit with that for a moment. The radical humility of it. Jesus, over and over, choosing to call himself a person, a human being, someone like you. And what the church did centuries later was take that phrase and turn it into something cosmic, something metaphysical, something that would have been unrecognizable to the man who actually said it. That's not a small distortion. That changes everything about how you hear the Gospels. Go back and read any passage where Jesus says Son of Man. Replace it with I. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. That's I came not to be served, but to serve. The Son of Man will be betrayed and killed. That's I will be betrayed and killed. The Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. That's I have authority to forgive sins. You hear the difference? One sounds like a cosmic title being invoked. The other sounds like a man standing in front of you, looking you in the eye, telling you what he's about to do. And scholars like Casey have argued that the second version is probably closer to what his audience actually heard, because in Aramaic, that's exactly what bar enash meant. It wasn't special. It wasn't mysterious. It was as ordinary as saying this guy or a fellow like me. The mystery was manufactured later by people writing in a different language, for a different audience, with a different agenda. Now someone listening to this might say, hold on, what about Daniel? And that's a fair question because it's the question I had too. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, there's a famous vision. The prophet sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days, and being given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Christians have been connecting that passage to Jesus for almost 2,000 years. It's one of the foundations of traditional Christology. But there's a problem, and it's a serious one. Modern scholarship has shown that this connection, the idea that Daniel's Son of Man figure was already understood as the Messiah before Jesus came along, is shaky at best. The historian Larry Hurtado, who was no radical, who spent his career at the University of Edinburgh, studying early Christian devotion, called the idea of a pre-Christian Son of Man title, and I'm quoting him here, an obsolete phantom. It didn't exist the way we were told it did. There is one text that gets close, the Parables of Enoch, found in a section of the book called 1st Enoch, chapters 37 through 71. This is the only pre-Christian Jewish text that takes Daniel's figure and interprets it in a messianic way. But even this text is disputed. Most scholars date it to somewhere in the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, which means it might have been written around the same time as the Gospels themselves, or even after. And its influence on mainstream Jewish thought before Jesus was, by most accounts, minimal. So what likely happened is this. Jesus used bar enash the way any Aramaic speaker would, as a humble self-reference. His followers, many of whom eventually spoke and wrote in Greek, didn't fully understand the Aramaic idiom. They heard their teacher use this phrase dozens of times, and when they went looking for meaning, they found Daniel's vision. And they made a connection that Jesus himself may never have intended. They took a man saying, I'm a person, and turned it into a figure descending on clouds with cosmic authority. That's not history. That's theology being built after the fact. And you can actually watch this process happen if you read the Gospels in the order they were written. Start with Mark, the earliest Gospel. In Mark, there is no virgin birth. There is no story of Jesus existing before creation. Jesus shows up at the Jordan River as an adult and gets baptized by John. And at that moment, the heavens open and a voice says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." But pay attention to who hears this. In Mark's version, this is private. This voice speaks to Jesus alone. It's not an announcement to the crowd. And some scholars have argued that what Mark is describing here is adoptionism, the idea that Jesus became God's son at that specific moment, at his baptism. He wasn't born divine. He was chosen, adopted, elevated. That idea alone, if you grew up in the church like I did, is enough to make you set the book down and stare at the wall for a while. Because it means the earliest gospel writer, the one closest in time to the actual events, may not have believed what we were taught to believe about Jesus' nature from the start. Then you move to Matthew and Luke, written 10 to 20 years later. Now suddenly there are birth narratives, angels appearing to Mary, a virgin conception. The divinity gets pushed backward from baptism to birth. Jesus doesn't become God's son at the Jordan River anymore. He's God's son from the moment of conception. Then you get to John, the last gospel, written around 90 to 100 AD, and John opens with the most extraordinary theological claim in the entire New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now divinity doesn't start at birth or baptism. It starts before creation itself. Jesus is the eternal Word made flesh. The scholar Bart Ehrman has traced this evolution clearly. Divinity moves from baptism to birth to pre-existence. Each gospel pushes the claim further back in time, further up in status. And with each step, the phrase Son of Man, that humble Aramaic bar enash, gets further from what Jesus meant by it, and closer to something no first-century Galilean fisherman or tax collector would have recognized. By the time John writes his prologue, we're not talking about a tired rabbi on a dusty road saying, "I have nowhere to sleep." We're talking about the eternal Logos, the cosmic word, God in human form. That's a long journey from bar enash, and it happened in about 60 years. I found Geza Vermes' book, Jesus the Jew, in a dollar box at the Lawson McGee Library here in Knoxville. Hardcover, brown dust jacket, pages yellowed at the edges. I opened it standing between the shelves in the history section, and I turned to the chapter about bar enash. I read the whole thing sitting on the floor with my back against the shelf, and when I got to the part where Vermes explained that Son of Man was just an ordinary Aramaic way of saying, I, me, a person, I had to close the book and put it on my lap and just sit there. Because it meant that every time I'd heard that phrase in church, every time a preacher had made it sound mysterious and cosmic, they were putting weight on a word that was never meant to carry it. I bought the book for $1. I still have it. The spine is cracked now from how many times I've read it. I walked out of that library and sat on a bench in the sun for 30 minutes before I could drive. Not because I was angry, because the world had just rearranged itself, and I needed a moment to find my balance. That was the same summer I found Spinoza. Different shelf, same library. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. And Spinoza said something in that book that hit me like a freight train. He said that we must read Scripture as Scripture, not as theology. Not as what the church tells us it means, but as what the words actually say on the page. Spinoza was doing in 1670 what I was doing with my legal pad at 3 in the morning. Reading the text honestly and being brave enough to write down what he found. Now stay with me on this, because here is one of the strangest parts of the whole story. After the Gospels, Son of Man vanishes. It disappears from the Christian vocabulary almost completely. Paul, who wrote the earliest Christian documents we have, the letters dating from the 50s AD, about 20 years after Jesus' death, Paul never uses the phrase. Not once. In all of Romans, all of Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Thessalonians, all those passionate, theological, deeply argued letters about who Jesus is and what his death means, Paul calls Jesus Lord, Christ, Son of God, the last Adam, the image of the invisible God. He never calls him Son of Man. The only appearance of the phrase after the Gospels in the entire New Testament is in Acts chapter 7, verse 56, when Stephen, the first Christian martyr, is being stoned to death and cries out, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. One single use in a dying man's vision, and then silence. Why? The answer, according to the best scholarship I've read, is that the phrase simply didn't translate. Greek-speaking Christians, which is what most early Christians outside Palestine were, had no framework for the Aramaic idiom. Bar enash didn't mean anything in Greek the way it meant something in Galilean villages. So they preserved it in the Gospels, because those were sacred accounts of Jesus' own words. But when they built their own theology, they reached for titles that worked in their language, their culture, their philosophical world. Lord, which carried echoes of the Roman emperor. Christ, the Greek translation of Messiah. Son of God, which in Hellenistic culture already had a rich tradition of meaning. And here is the irony that still keeps me up some nights. When early Christian scribes copied the Gospels by hand, they used special abbreviations called nomina sacra, sacred names. They would contract certain words and draw a line over them to mark their holiness. God was one, Lord was one, and Son of Man was one too. They treated the phrase as sacred. They gave it the same reverence they gave the word God. But they never used it to describe their faith. They never built a single sermon, a single creed, a single hymn around the phrase Jesus used most. They honored it with their pens and ignored it with their theology. I want you to picture that. A monk in a cold scriptorium somewhere in Egypt or Syria, carefully copying the Gospel of Mark by candlelight. He comes to the word Son of Man. He knows this is sacred. He contracts it, draws a careful line over the abbreviation, the way he would for the name of God itself. He handles the phrase with reverence, and yet, if you ask that same monk what he believed, he would recite a creed that never mentions Son of Man. Not once. He would tell you Jesus is the Son of God, the Lord, the Christ. The words he treated as holy on the page, he had already replaced in his heart. That contradiction sat in manuscripts for centuries, and almost no one noticed. The Council of Nicaea met in 325 AD. Emperor Constantine gathered over 300 bishops from across the Roman Empire to the city of Nicaea, in what is now Turkey. The church was tearing itself apart over the question of who Jesus really was. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, was teaching that Jesus was the first and greatest of God's creations, but still created, still subordinate, not co-equal with the Father. Athanasius and his allies were arguing the opposite, that Jesus was of the same essence as God, fully divine, not created but begotten. The debate was fierce, and according to some accounts, occasionally physical. Bishops shouted. According to one ancient account, a bishop named Nicholas of Myra, the man who would later become the legend behind Santa Claus, walked across the room and slapped Arius in the face. Whether that's true or embellished, it tells you the temperature of the room. Constantine wanted unity for his empire. He didn't particularly care about the theology. He cared about order. He cared about having a single faith that could bind together a fracturing empire. And he pushed for a resolution. What came out of that council was the Nicene Creed, and I want you to listen to what it says. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all ages, light of light, true God from true God, begotten not made, of one essence with the Father. Son of God. That's the title they built the creed around. That's the word that defines Orthodox Christianity to this day. Son of Man, the title Jesus used over 80 times, does not appear in the Nicene Creed. It does not appear in the Apostles' Creed. It does not appear in the Athanasian Creed. It does not appear in any creed ever in the entire 2,000-year history of Christianity. The title Jesus chose for himself is absent from every official statement of Christian faith. There's a document scholars call the Q source, a collection of Jesus' sayings that both Matthew and Luke appear to have used as source material. Most scholars date it to the 50s or 60s AD, making it earlier than any complete gospel we have. Q contains 8 Son of Man sayings. It contains 0 uses of the word Christ or Messiah. 0. The earliest recoverable layer of Jesus' own teaching uses Son of Man. The latest theological layer, the creeds and councils, uses Son of God. The flip is total and complete. What Jesus called himself and what the church calls him are 2 different things, and the distance between them is not a crack. It's a canyon. And nobody told us. I sat in that church for 50 years, And nobody ever stood up at the pulpit and said, by the way, Jesus preferred a different title for himself, and we chose not to use it. Nobody mentioned the Aramaic. Nobody mentioned bar enash. Nobody said that Son of Man might just mean a human being. That silence isn't an oversight. When you have 2,000 years to talk about something and you choose not to, that's a decision. I've been sitting with this for 3 years now. Some mornings it sits easy and some mornings it doesn't. But I keep coming back to that legal pad, those 2 columns, that quiet kitchen at 3 in the morning. Because what I found that night was real. The numbers were real, the Aramaic is real, the silence of the creeds is real. And I think you deserve to know about it. I don't tell you all this to tear anything down. I'm 67 years old. I was a deacon at First Baptist for 22 years. I taught Sunday school for almost as long as I taught American history. My wife is buried under a headstone with a cross on it, and I still visit her every Saturday morning with grocery store flowers and a cup of coffee. I drink sitting in the grass beside her. I'm not angry at the church. I'm not angry at God. I'm not even angry at the people who taught me things that turned out to be more complicated than they let on. What I am is honest. And honesty means that when you sit down with a pencil and a legal pad and you count what's actually in the text, you write down what you find, you don't erase the marks because they scare you. Spinoza taught me that. Or maybe I should say Spinoza gave me permission to do what I was already doing. He said, read the text as text, not as what you were told it means, not as what you need it to mean. Just read what's there. And what's there is a man who called himself bar enash 87 times, a human being, a person like you and me, and a church that heard those words and decided they weren't enough, decided that human wasn't grand enough, wasn't powerful enough, wasn't worthy of worship, so they reached for Son of God instead. They reached for Lord, for Christ, for the Word made flesh. And maybe they were right to do it. Maybe there's a truth in that reaching that goes beyond what any scholar can measure. I don't know. What I do know is that the words matter. What a man calls himself matters. And if Jesus of Nazareth stood in dusty Galilean villages and said over and over, I am a person, I am bar enash, I am a human being like you, then we owe it to him to at least hear that. To let those words sit in the room without rushing to explain them away. The truth of a man is in what he says about himself when he thinks it matters. And 87 times is not an accident. That's a man telling you who he is. Whether you build a church on it or sit quietly with it at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, that's up to you. But you should know what he said. You should know what the words actually were before anyone changed them.